Welcome to Advanced Darkroom Photography. The first thing I want to cover is a review of how the camera works, so we can get right into shooting film our first week of class. Before we can talk about the actual cameras, let's get back to our camera settings. And the most important ones to think about while we're shooting is shutter speed and aperture. First we have shutter speed, the how long, the how much time it's going to take for this photo to be taken within the camera. How long that light is going to come in and get exposed to the film. So we can control that time by a faster shutter speed or a slower shutter speed. That's going to be our primary function of shutter speed. The secondary function of shutter speed is going to be to freeze or blur action. We can slow down the movement of an object, or we can freeze it in time depending on how fast or slow that shutter is going to be. Aperture is our second function we want to think about in the camera. An aperture is completely housed inside the lens. So shutter is in the camera, aperture is in the lens. An aperture is how much light comes into that lens. We can control that opening, whether it's going to be open really wide or it's going to be open really small, and how much of the light is coming in at a time. It's also going to control how much space is in focus. If we have a lot of space, for miles and miles, like a landscape shot, or we're going to have a blurry background with a singular subject, such as a person or a flower. So by putting the two together, shutter speed and aperture, we wind up with successful photos. Okay, so let's take a look at shutter speed and how that works. Here we have this pear that is falling in space, and in one side of the screen, the shutter speed was 200th of a second. So it's freezing the pear right there in midair. The other side of the screen is a 15th of a second, a slower shutter speed, and it's blurring the action of the object as it's falling. Okay. Here's a photo I took of my daughter jumping on our trampoline, and I froze her action in midair. I actually remember that the shutter speed to this was about 1,000th of a second, and I took this in a burst mode, which can be done in film. It's a little tricky. You have to have one of the cameras that's able to do that, where you take a series of photos and then you're able to go back and pick the best one for the situation. Here is the opposite, a slow motion shot of a waterfall. So we've slowed down the speed of this water cascading over the edge of this waterfall. This was half a second shutter speed. So we have a fast shutter speed where we can freeze action, and we have a slow shutter speed where we can blur action. And this becomes the photographer's choice. When they're choosing to slow things down or speed things up, it's a personal decision. It has to do with your subject, your location, and what outcome you want to get. On almost all the cameras, the shutter speed is selected by just twisting this selection dial. Okay, so we have from 1,000th of a second on this one all the way down to 1 second, and then you notice the letter B. The letter B is for bulb, which means we can leave the shutter open for as long as we choose, and that would be used for something like a light trail or star trails at night. If you would like to get into doing some of that stuff, just let me know and we can set you up. Alright, so shutter speed has rules. Everything in photography has some level of rules. The smaller the number, the more light that's going to come in the camera. However, if the subject is moving, it could be blurry, and that might not be your intention. So it's good for shade and things that don't move. The larger number, the shorter the time the shutter is open, or the faster the shutter speed. It's good for catching action, but it doesn't let in a lot of light. When holding the camera in your hands, never use less than 60th of a second. 125 is even better because that's where you can start to freeze some action. Your hands are going to naturally shake that camera, so always be at 60 or higher, which in film photography does not leave us with a lot of room. We have about 60, 125, 250, 500, 1,000. We have 5 or so shutter speeds to pick from on most of our cameras as we're walking around with them. If you need a lower shutter speed under 60th of a second, you're going to use a tripod to hold the camera still. We'll do this on a field trip later in the semester. Alright, on to aperture, how to select one. The aperture is going to be determined by the lens that's on that particular camera. So you can see this one ranges from 2 to 16. There are some lenses that we have that go wider than 2. They'll go to 1.4, and they'll go higher than 16. They'll go to 22, even 32. Okay, So just depending on what lens is attached to which camera, we'll have a variety of apertures, but generally we'll have somewhere between 2.8 to 11 will always be there. And this is where our depth of field comes into play. How much space is in focus? When we have our closed up aperture, f11, we can see lots of details in the background, and when we have our open aperture, f2, we can see that the background is starting to blur. We can't even tell how many plates are there. Here's an example of open aperture, f2.2, blurring the background behind a single subject. And then here's a closed aperture of f18, where now everything's in focus. Same flower, same spot, just changing that aperture, we wind up with very different results. Okay, just like with shutter speed, aperture has some rules. The smaller number, the more light that comes into the camera, but the smaller number means less of an area can be in focus. So it's good for close-ups of people, objects, flowers, etc. When you want to blur the background, open the aperture. The larger number, the less light's going to come in the camera, but a larger area will be in focus. So it's good for large groups, sports, landscapes, etc. How to balance the light using the light meter. We have two basic light meters in our camera, and if it is something different, I'll let you know before you take it home. So here we have the Minolta, or the one we call the number, which means when you look through the viewfinder, on the right side of your field of vision, you'll see a range of the shutter speed numbers. And when you press and hold the shutter release button, you're going to take your meter reading, and it's going to tell you how much light is coming in the camera and which shutter speed is going to work for that situation. In this case, it's showing us a shutter speed of 8. Well, we know that we can't use 8 with the camera in our hands, so we're going to have to make adjustments to this. In this case, the adjustment would be to open the aperture. By opening the aperture, we've let more light come in the camera, allowing us to use a faster shutter speed and not needing a tripod. So now our light meter is reading 500, and we can successfully take our photo. Don't forget to twist that lens to focus before you click the shutter. The Vivitar. This is a really popular camera here in class. A lot of students like these, and we have quite a few of them. This comes with a plus, minus sign, green circle format for the light meter. And there's a few other brands of cameras that have the same kind. So right now we're looking through the viewfinder. It's giving me a plus sign, too bright, too much light is coming in the camera. You're going to burn your toast. Okay, we don't want to have our pictures come out with too much light coming in the camera. So we make some adjustments, we raise our shutter speed, we close up our aperture. All right, maybe now we went too far. Minus, minus, minus. Not enough light's coming in the camera. We have to slow down the shutter this time. We need to open the aperture. Okay? Once we see that green circle, we're good to go. Mostly what I do with the Vivitar camera is I look at the top, I find a shutter speed I know is going to work for my lighting situation or my subject situation. Let's say it's 250. I know I don't have to worry about my hands shaking the camera. I press and hold down on that shutter release button and roll my aperture ring until I see the green circle. I'm not taking into account the depth of field so much, but I know I'm getting the right amount of light, I'm using a proper shutter speed, and that is going to get me to a place where I can have a photo that I'm going to really be happy with. Any questions? Just ask Mrs. Hoolan, shoot me an email if you're at home and something's going on with your camera that you don't know what to do with. But I hope that this review will be able to get you started and taking some great pictures right away this semester.